Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure. The Pybus Public Market is pleased to offer a series of unique and fun classes for the Wenatchee Valley community. Classes are taught by local volunteers with an interest and aptitude in the subjects that they teach.
Let's talk about food and wine considerations. Before we get into pairing, let's talk about the wine itself. So there's 5 basic wine characteristics when we talk about wine that we usually pay attention to. Sweetness, acidity, tannin, alcohol, and body. So those 5 things kind of make up what we call the structure of the wine. Okay. Other considerations when it comes to wine. How about flavors, right? Flavors add another complexity when trying to pair stuff. There's many different fruits, right? We have tree fruit, apple, pear, stone fruit, peach, nectarine, apricot, citrus, lemon, lime, orange, red, blue, black fruit, right? Blackberry, cherry, blueberries, you name it, right? I could stand up here for probably a couple hours and name all the different flavors. But we also have the condition of the fruit that it's in too, right? And when I mean the condition, I mean is that fruit, is it more dried, is it baked, is it peeled, is it stewed, is it tart, is it jammy, is it fresh, right? So all of that adds another layer of complexity. Also, we have other things besides just fruit and wine, right? As far as flavor-wise, we have non-fruit, that could be floral, could be herbs, spices, vegetal tones, could be earthiness, kind of that clay, mineral, slate, chalky. If the wine sees any kind of oak, it adds another complexion too, right? We get kind of those baking spices, vanilla, clove, smoke, dill, you name it. Hopefully you're getting my point that wine is a very complex beverage. But we also have to think about temperature too, right? We drink wines at different temperatures. Our nice bright whites at cooler temperatures, and our big bold reds are closer to room temperature, and there's everything in between, right? So that adds complexity too. Food considerations. We have our taste elements. We have sweet, sour, bitter, salt, and umami, right? That savory component. And we also have different textures when it comes to food too, right? Think of the texture of soup versus the texture of steak, versus the texture of maybe cheese and crackers, so forth. So all of those have different textures too, right? So leading into pairing with food, as you can tell, it can get really complex, right? There's a saying, we're going to try to keep it simple. There's a saying when it comes to food and wine, 1 + 1 = 3. Right? So you have your food and your wine, and together they create this synergy, right? You're trying to enhance both the food and the wine together. You don't want the food to overwhelm the wine, and you don't want the wine to overwhelm the food, right? They should both bring out the best qualities of each other. So I have 3 rules. They're on the sheet in front of you. Rule number 1, which is usually my number 1 go-to rule, and that is think regionally, right? If it grows together, it goes together. So when you think about it, this makes sense. Animals, the proteins that we eat, the different vegetables and fruits, the produce that we eat, grow in the same region, same climates, use the same soils. And in theory, they should go together. How many people have ever heard of the word terroir? I know a couple people have, yeah. So terroir is a French term, and there's no direct English translation, but loosely translated, it means a sense of place, or the sum of all parts. And so it's a big thing in wine when we talk about terroir. There's all these factors that go into it. And it's no different when we're trying to pair wine and food together as well. So if you think about it, many of the same basic ingredients are eaten all over the world. An example would be chicken, right? So each region adds its own kind of regional flavor profile. For example, in France, we probably have herb kind of roasted chicken, whereas in our Asian countries, it's probably more stir-fried soy sauce. Right? The protein's the same, but the way maybe preparation, accent ingredients are very different. So the question you need to ask yourself is, where did the meal originate from that you're preparing? And then it kind of gives you a guideline from there. So this is pretty fundamental when it comes to food and wine pairing. Usually a regional match is your best match and kind of your go-to when you're thinking about it. So examples of regional would be Italian food with Italian wine, right? Kind of your Chianti. How many people like Chianti with their kind of pizza, pasta, lasagna, right? There's a reason those go together. We'll talk about that later. But there's also, take our friends down south in Willamette Valley. They do a wonderful job with Pinot Noirs, right? Pinot Noirs with cow's cheese from Willamette Valley are a match made in heaven, right? There's that terroir thing, right? They come from the same place. So regional matches aren't always perfect, but they're usually give you a good template of what's going on, and then you can kind of branch out from there. So any questions on rule number 1? Number 2, come to your senses. So this is basically letting your 5 senses guide you when it comes to food and wine. I think a lot of people don't trust their senses all the time, right? You know a bad pairing when you have one, and you probably know a good pairing when you have one too, right? And I don't think we trust our senses as much as we should. But the old adage, red wine with red meat and white wine with white meat or white fish, doesn't really, there's a lot of gray area nowadays, right? Probably 20, 30 years ago, that was very black and white, right? You'd have steak with your cab, and you'd have Pinot Grigio with your fish, or Chardonnay with your fish, and you wouldn't think about drinking anything else with those 2 things. But now the line has kind of blurred, there's more gray area, and we can kind of play around. Today's food is more complex, right? We have primary ingredients, we have accent ingredients, we have all the seasoning, sauces, we have all the different preparation methods too, right? Braised, barbecued, stewed, sauteed, etc., etc. So when it comes to your senses, I have kind of 4 sub-tips in rule number 2 to get a little bit more advanced. But the first one is to think about the weight of the food. So you need the weight of the wine to match the weight of the dish or food that you are eating. So we usually describe wine as being light, medium, or heavy bodied, and your food or your dish or meal could be considered the same thing, right? It could be a lighter style, which would be maybe like some kind of fish, and a heavier body would be some kind of your T-bone steak or something like that. So one tool that you can use to kind of help you figure out the actual weight as far as on the wine side of things is the alcohol level. This is a good indication. This will be a good indicator of the body, the weight of the wine. Usually 10 to 12% is a lighter styled wine. 12 to 14 would be considered a medium or a moderate bodied wine. And anything above 14% is usually considered a heavier wine. If that doesn't really help, think of wine with other beverages. So your lighter styled wines, like your Pinot Noirs or your Rieslings, would be kind of similar to water, that water feel on the palate. If you were to go up a next step, like medium-bodied wines, like say a Viognier or a Merlot, very similar to what 2% would feel like on the palate. And then if you were to go up to the full-bodied wines, heavily oaked Chardonnay or Cab, something along those lines that are big, bold, it would be similar to how whole milk would feel on the palate. So those are some tools that you can kind of use when it comes to figuring out the weight, at least, of your wine.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
Have a fun video you'd like to see featured on NCW Life? Email us at newsphotos@ncwlife.com.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
Number 2 would be volume. So when I say volume, I'm talking about the flavor volume of the wine and the food. Think of it, volume as kind of the overall intensity of that food or beverage. So if you were to, I'm a visual guy, like I said, so if you imagine we were putting food through these speakers tonight, right, on a scale of 1 to 10. If you were to put poached scallops through that stereo speaker on the volume dial, where would that be at? Probably closer to 1 or a 2, right? Really light, really light and really low on the volume, intensity-wise. What if you were to put a ribeye steak with blue cheese and onion strings through the stereo? Where would that be? 9 or a 10, right? So that's how I visualize kind of the intensity or the volume of the wine. Does that make sense? Number 3 would be texture. Think of your mouth as Goldilocks. It doesn't want to be too dry or too wet, right? It always wants to be kind of right at the middle. If your mouth is feeling too dry, you want something creamy to restore the lubrication in it. And if it's too wet, you want something to get rid of that excess kind of greasy feeling to clean it out, right? An example when it comes to food would be a hamburger, right? We have that greasiness probably from the meat, but what helps cut that greasiness? We have mustard, we have ketchup, and we have relish or pickles, right? What are those? Those are higher in acidity, and that acidity will cut through that greasiness of the hamburger. Does that make sense? No different in food and wine pairings. One of my favorite examples is Riesling and a German bratwurst, right? That bratwurst is kind of, has a little bit of fattiness, a greasiness to it. Riesling is an underrated food wine. Riesling is high in acidity and it cuts right through that greasiness of the bratwurst. So if you ever get a chance to try that pairing out, that's a fun one. I know a place, a few miles, a place called Leavenworth that sells some bratwurst. Another one example of that would be fried chicken and sparkling wine. Sparkling wine has awesome acidity to it, right? And so it will cut through that greasiness of the fried chicken. So you're using the acidity to kind of cut through the fattiness. So that's kind of example of when it comes to texture-wise. Temperature-wise, this would be number 4. As foods become hotter, the food's texture changes too, right? As it gets hotter, liquids become thinner and solids will begin to melt. The same roasted chicken that you have served warm on, say, Saturday night with your Chardonnay will go really well cold with your chilled rosé for your picnic on Sunday. So temperature, you can use the same proteins, but depending on the temperature of that protein and or wine can be a fun pairing to play around with as well. Cooking techniques, real quickly. Tuna's a good example, right? It can be served raw, as in sushi. Goes great really with Riesling and Pinot Gris, or it could be hot off the grill, and sparkling and Pinot Noir is a good match when it comes straight off the grill, being warm. Also, I don't think we gravitate towards this, but I don't think we really think about it. The different seasons, right? We tend to drink lighter styled bodied wines in the summer, and in the winter we tend to eat heavier foods too, right? And so we drink heavier foods. We're eating more of those stews and casseroles in the wintertime, right? And what do we drink? We drink the Malbecs, we drink the Syrahs, we drink the Cabs, the big bold reds, right? And in the summer, we're eating salads and fish, and we're drinking more rosés and lighter styled whites, right? So something to think about too. So under rule number 2, we have weight, volume, texture, and temperature. Rule number 3, last rule, and then we'll move on to a different topic. Rule number 3, balance components. So we talked about the 5 basic components that you can perceive, right? Sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. And these are at play both in the food and the wine. Components and flavors match together in 2 different ways. Number 1 would be the complementary pairing. A complementary pairing creates a balance by contrasting taste and flavors. And then we have the second way, and that would be a congruent pairing, right? A congruent pairing creates a balance by amplifying shared flavor compounds or similarities. Non-wine examples would be, for complementary, root beer float, right? We have that rich creaminess of the vanilla ice cream, and then we have that bright acidity from the soda that cuts through, right? Pretty good match, pretty fun match to do, okay? For congruent pairing, how about your Oreos and dipping it in your milk, right? They both have that creamy, rich texture, and they're both going together, and they also have kind of that sweetness too, right? How about wine examples? Complementary pairing, how many people like blue cheese with their dessert wine? Yeah, if you haven't tried it out, try like a late harvest or an ice wine or something like that that's a little bit on the sweeter side and kind of something along the lines cheese-wise blue cheese, something with that kind of tanginess and saltiness. It's kind of going back to that sweet and salty kind of yin and yang kind of pairing. Another complementary would be big tannic wines like a Malbec or Cabernet with your fatty dishes like a steak. That's one of kind of a quintessential wine and food pairing is that fattiness from the steak and the tannic big bold wines. Congruent pairing would be like a high acid wine like say Sauvignon Blanc with salty and acidic foods like oysters. Anybody like oysters? Yeah, try your Sauv Blancs. It's like your Sancerres from France. Awesome pairing. Another example of congruent pairing would be maybe a high acidic red wine like Sangiovese, which we'll talk about here in a sec. Sangiovese is the grape based in your Chianti wines. And what did we talk about earlier? The Chianti goes great with Italian food, right? So your pizzas, pastas, lasagnas, anything that has that red sauce with it, Sangiovese goes great because it matches the acidity level in the tomato sauce, okay? Let's move on and talk about the holidays. So not everyone eats the same thing, same things on Thanksgiving or Christmas. But there are some general foods that we find at most households. So let's talk about some food and wine pairings that will kind of help you out, lead to the best pairings. So let's talk about Thanksgiving. The glass that you have in front of you, you now have permission to drink. It is our 2012 Sangiovese. And we'll talk more about that here in a sec. But for Thanksgiving, there's 4 kind of fundamental components of Thanksgiving dinner, right? Number 1 would be protein, and that's where we usually start for most dishes or meals, is our protein based. What's that for Thanksgiving? Usually turkey, right? Then we have another component, dry spices, right? These are used a lot. We have rosemary, cloves, cinnamon, sage, and we could go on and on, right? But we use a lot of dried spices with Thanksgiving. The third component of dinner is usually some kind of roasted vegetables, right? And they're usually prepared in the oven. Number 4, the fourth component of Thanksgiving dinner is some kind of winter fruits or vegetables, potatoes, squash, cranberries, something along those lines, right? So when you put these components together, it starts to eliminate certain groups of wine, right? For instance, white wine doesn't really go great with roasted vegetables, right? They're usually they have too much character, too much flavor to go. They overwhelm the white wine. And turkey usually eliminates big, bold red wines. Turkey's more of a milder protein, right? So typically we can't drink our Malbecs, Petit Syrahs, our Petit Verdots, our Cabernet Sauvignons with turkey because it overwhelms the turkey. So where does that leave us? Generally, lighter bodied and moderate bodied reds. So varietals to look for are Barbera, Gamay, Pinot Noir, Grenache, and Sangiovese. That's why you're drinking our Sangiovese tonight. Our Sangiovese, and typically in general, Sangiovese has bright red fruit, matches great with cranberry sauce. If you're like me, I put cranberry sauce all over my plate on Thanksgiving, right? Eat potatoes, stuffing, turkey, put it on everything. Sangiovese has good acidity, so it cuts through if you're a dark meat fan, right? If you like the legs or the thighs, that high acidity will cut through some of that fattiness that the dark meat has. Moderate bodied, Sangiovese has a moderate body, doesn't overwhelm the turkey so much. And if you're a fan of Italian Chiantis, like we've talked about, they're usually a little bit more on the earthy, herbaceous side of things. So they'll kind of have that oregano, sage, rosemary thing going on. So, and we use that to accent our meals as well, right? So a fun one to play around with.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure. Are you wanting high-speed internet but don't have access to PUD fiber? Try Sky-Fi high-speed wireless internet from LocalTel. Call 888-8888 today. Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
All right, let's talk about what falls next on the calendar, and that would be Christmas. There's several classic dishes served at Christmas, right? Ham, turkey again. How about roast beef? Those are some three common ones that we find at Christmas. We already talked about turkey, so we'll skip that one. So let's talk about ham. Again, we have kind of our usual, this meal is usually accompanied by our winter vegetables and roasted sides, right? As far as ham goes, it can kind of be a saltier meat, right? And depending on if you like some kind of glaze on your ham, right, that can add maybe a little bit of sweetness. Again, it goes back to that kind of sweet and salty thing. So options here are Grenache, your GSM blends, your Rhone blends. We call them GSM blends because it's usually a blend of Grenache, Mourvedre, and Syrah. So that's where the GSM comes from. But you'll find those those blends a lot in the Rhone Valley of France. And Rosé. And that's what you have in front of you right now. This is our 2016 Rosé. And rosés are great, especially a dry rosé. This one has a little bit of residual sugar in it, so you get that kind of sweet thing up front, but it finishes nice, clean, and crisp on the finish. Rosés in general, though, usually have a good amount of fruit to kind of match maybe the sweetness from the glaze on the ham. They usually have a bright acidity, so it can also cut through the sweetness, right, if you're using kind of a complementary pairing. And rosé is kind of a lighter style wine, so it doesn't overwhelm the protein as well. How many people like rosés? Yeah, all right, we got some rosé fans. Yes, sir.
What exactly is a rosé?
What exactly is a rosé? So it is a style of wine. So you start making rosé the same way that you would make your red wine. So you'd harvest your grapes, bring it into the winery. You would sort your grapes if there was any kind of leaves or stems or anything like that before fermenting. They would go through what we call the destemmer and crusher. So get on YouTube or Google and watch this. It's a pretty cool process, but you put it in this big bin and it goes through an auger and it actually beats the grapes off the stems, right? And the grapes fall into a vat. So after that goes on, then it goes through a period that we call maceration, and that's the soaking of the skin, seeds, and stems with the actual juice content from the grapes. Now this is where it gets different from a red wine and a rosé wine. Usually that maceration period can last 2, 3, 4 weeks for a red wine. And for a rosé, it's anywhere from a couple of hours up to 48 hours. So the skin, which contains the pigment, is where we get the color for red wines. So if you were to leave the juice in contact with the skin longer, you're going to have more of the red wine color, but you're also going to get more of the phenolic components, which are the tannins. And so for a rosé wine, it's only in contact maybe a couple hours with the juice, and so you'll have a very light color and you won't have all those tannins as well. So then it's finished, both are usually finished the same, right? After that maceration period, it could be aged in stainless steel tanks or oak, usually not for rosés, but, and then it's aged for a period of time and then bottled. So the main differences between rosé and red is the maceration period. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I gather that a rosé could be any number of...
Yes, a rosé can be made from Sangiovese, Malbec, Cabernet, Merlot, Syrah, totally up to you. And you don't really see rosés made from white grapes, right? Because they don't have the dark pigmentation. So if you were to make a white wine that was left on its skins, you would probably have a white wine.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
For all the latest news in North Central Washington, go to ncwlife.com or find us on Facebook. Got a news tip? Email us at news@ncwlife.com or call 888-2020.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
We've talked about turkey, we've talked about ham. Let's talk about some red meat, some roast beef. So beef has a little bit more structure, a little more gusto, a little more oomph to it, right? It also has a little bit more fat content, right? Some cuts can be. Roast beef's usually not too bad, but it can be. Have a little bit more fat. So we have to go a little bit heavier bodied in wine, right? Something to stand up to the structure of the red wine, but we also need something with a little bit more tannin content to help us out to balance the fat content in our protein. So side note on tannins and fat, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times, but tannins are the natural compound found in plants, right? So they give us that, they're found in grapes as well. They're the things that give us the drying sensation, that astringent feeling on the palate. It's the same thing if you were to eat walnuts or pecans or drink a glass of really long steeped green or black tea, right? We have that kind of drying, kind of astringent feeling on the palate. That's tannins. So have you ever noticed how most people serve some kind of cheese or salami or charcuterie that it's pretty common when we're wine tasting, right? Anybody wonder why that is, besides that it tastes really good? So usually those cuts of meat like salami and cheese have fat content in them, right? Big red wines have these tannins content in them. It's kind of a unique relationship that fat and tannin has. We have receptors on our tongue that if we drink too much red wine, those receptors get filled with tannins. Anybody ever been out wine tasting and just come to the point and your palate is just so full of big tannic wines that you can't really taste anything else, right? You can almost feel the tannins on your tongue if you were to scrape it with your teeth, right? So those receptors get so full that we need something to kind of cleanse them, kind of wipe them out, and that's where fat comes into play. And so that's where the cheese and the fatty cuts of meat kind of help clear out those receptors. So that's kind of the tannin and fat relationship. Does that make sense?
Salt involved in that.
Say that again?
Salt, is that?
Salt? No, not really. No. Fattier foods like cheese and the salami tend to be fat just because of the process they go through. But yeah, salt doesn't really have, it does affect your palate, but it doesn't have anything to do with tannins. So back to roast beef. That was kind of a side note. So you're drinking our 2013 Cabernet Franc. Wines that you should look for with roast beef, as I said, should have maybe a little bit more tannin to them. Moderate wines with roast beef are good because there isn't too much fat in roast beef and there's not too many tannins in a moderate styled wine. Wines to look for, varietal wise. Again, you could maybe use a Sangiovese here, depending if it was a little heavier Sangiovese, but Merlot would be a nice one as well. Tempranillo. Anybody have some Spanish Tempranillos? Kind of similar to Merlot and Cab, really excellent with food. And Carmenere. Anybody ever had Carmenere? If not, I suggest you come back and do a little tasting. We have a fine shameless plug here. We have a fine Carmenere here, the first one that we've ever made. The Carmenere usually has good acidity, moderate tannins, very similar to Merlot in style, maybe a little bit elevated acidity, but a little bit more herbaceous tones, kind of that bell pepper or green peppercorn thing in Carmenere too, which makes it fun to play around with food too. And then we have Cab Franc, and that's what you have in your glass right now. Very similar to Cab Sauv, but just kind of less intensity, kind of less gust, just not as bold and intense as Cabernet Sauvignon, okay? A very moderate wine, good fruit-forward wine still, but kind of more in that moderate range. And when I mean moderate, you have, say, your lighter styled wines on one end of the spectrum, and then you have your big bold wines on the other end of the spectrum. Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Carmenere are kind of right in the middle, right? So you can play them up, dress them down, and go from there. So that's roast beef and Christmas. Any questions on that?
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
Is your vehicle in need of a quick oil change or tune-up before hitting the road this summer? Stop by Quick Lube and Tune, the home of the good guys at 610 South Wenatchee Avenue.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
So we got one more holiday, right? If you haven't broke the bank into in November or early December for Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? We got one more holiday to spend your whole budget, and that is New Year's Eve. We probably all know the wine of choice for New Year's Eve, right? What is that? Sparkling? Yeah, sparkling wine. So the Champagne region of France has been marketing itself and its wines as kind of that special occasion, celebratory kind of beverage since the late 1800s. What's the difference between sparkling wine and champagne? Region, yes. So Champagne comes from the Champagne region of France, right? It's a protected agriculture name. Similar to, we can't call things Burgundy or Bordeaux, right? We've entered an agreement with the EU that we won't name agriculture products after various regions, protected regions in Europe, like Bayonne hams, right? That comes from a certain area. We can't call sparkling wine champagne unless it comes from Champagne. We just have to call it sparkling wine. So that's kind of a little side note, but good champagne from France, usually not cheap if you've ever been to a store and looked for good champagne. So what are some other alternatives for champagne? How about cava? Anybody like cava? Had cava? Know what cava is? Cava is Spain's version of champagne. It's Spain's version of sparkling wine. Usually dry, usually good fruit, good acidity, great bubbles, awesome food wine. Anybody ever had a Cremant? Cremant de Bourgogne or Cremant d'Alsace. Cremants are names for sparkling wines that come from France, but outside the region of Champagne. So you could have pretty much a Cremant from anywhere else besides Champagne. Popular areas are Cremant d'Alsace region of France, Burgundy, even they're making some nice Bordeaux sparkling wines too. Last but not least, Prosecco. Anybody a fan of Prosecco? Yeah, it's very popular the last 3-5 years. The Champagne region of France has had some struggles as far as with Mother Nature on having good vintages, and so crops haven't been the best. Also, the price of champagne sometimes hurts too, and Prosecco is from Italy, and it's usually on the lower end of the price spectrum. It's usually a lighter style of sparkling too. Usually champagne or your traditional method sparkling wine usually has 6 atmospheres of pressure inside the bottle, and Prosecco usually has 3 to 4, so it doesn't have quite the effervescence that sparkling does, and it doesn't have this price tag like champagne does either. So if you're a fan of maybe lighter style sparkling wines, definitely check out Prosecco from Italy. So what if you're a fan, not a fan of sparkling wine? What do you do? So glad you asked. You're drinking the Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris from Jones. Look for something dry, kind of light and fruity, something like a Pinot Gris, Sauvignon Blanc, something that's crisp and refreshing, right? We usually eat kind of small bites, New Year's Eve. Some of us might do seafood. Seafood's very popular on New Year's Eve, right? And so those lighter style, drier white wines are excellent. They kind of have those citrus flavors, their zesty acidity, and usually fruit forward. Some other ones are Muscadet. Anybody like Muscadet from Loire? Yeah? Excellent with oysters. If you've ever had a nice dry Muscadet and oysters, yum yum. Albarino. Anybody like Albarino from Spain? Yeah, another really kind of dry white wine with good acidity and good fruit.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
Please join us weekly for the 12th District with yours truly, Kerry Condata. Check your channel guide for times or go to ncwlife.com for details.
Pybus University, where learning is a lifelong adventure.
Let's talk really quickly about gifts and gifting, and then we'll get you out of here. So I probably could have spent all evening talking about different wine gifts, but some important ones maybe for your wish list or for maybe the hard to shop for wino on your list. What are some good things? Glassware. Glassware is underrated when it comes to drinking wine, especially if you're really getting into it and want to evaluate it in a proper way. Glassware is probably the most important tool that you'll use. There's lots of different producers out there. One of my favorite, what you're drinking out of right now, is Riedel. They are Austrian glassmakers. They've been making, I think they're 11th generation company that's been making glassware. They can get kind of expensive. It doesn't have to be. They make pretty affordable gift packs. And you don't need to go out and buy all the different sets. They make almost a glassware for every varietal or style of wine, which can add up, right? My recommendation is to find a style of wine that you find yourself drinking and then get that glassware accordingly. So if you find yourself maybe drinking a lot of Chardonnay and Cab, I'd maybe get a set of 4 of Chardonnay glasses and a set of 4 of Cabernet glasses, and you should be good to go. So, how about preserving wine? This isn't a shameless plug, I promise, but we sell these here at the tasting room. They're called VacuVins. So we put the stopper in the top of the wine, and then we use the little pump to pump out the air. This helps preserve the wine a little bit better. If you're like me at our house, we usually don't have a problem finishing a bottle, but this does help with if your partner doesn't drink or if you live by yourself. It's a good investment. They're like $8, and it helps preserve it so you can enjoy the next glass of wine or half a bottle the next night. So that's a fun one. Booked? Yes.
How long would it be good?
2 days, 3 days would be kind of pushing it, but it really does help. So, book-wise, there's always some fun books. If you got a newbie wino, or if you're getting into wine, the Wine Bible from Karen McNeil is an awesome one. She's an awesome writer. I think the second edition is the latest one. Another good one for newbies is the Wine Folly Essential Guide to Wine from our friend Madeline Puckett. We actually have a copy at both of our tasting rooms for our employees to kind of look up fun stuff. If you're a visual learner, it's a fun book, very affordable too, like I want to say 20, 25, 30 bucks in there, something like that. A good one to have on hand. If you're a little bit more advanced, the World Atlas of Wine from our friends Hugh Johnson and Janice Robinson. Awesome book if you like the global scale of wine. Awesome maps, talks a lot about different producers. Very good book there. And another one would be the Oxford Companion to Wine. This is for your more of your studious wino that's really into. I opened this book and an hour later, even though I went to look for one thing, it's like a wormhole. There's a lot of references and things linked, and so you go to the next page. And very awesome book though for kind of more of your advanced wine learner. Your corksicle. I have one at home and I forgot it. How many people have ever seen the corksicle? No? You'll have to Google it. I'm sorry. But basically, it is a ice pack that looks like an icicle that you can stick in your wine to keep it cold for the patio. Very awesome investment. Say that again?
I have one for beer.
Oh, you have one for beer? Yeah. They make littler ones for beer bottles, for sure. Yeah. But the ones for the wine bottles a little bit thicker, a little bit longer too, so that it gets towards the bottom. But that's kind of a fun stocking stuffer. Also, Wine Away. We sell this here too, but you can get it at a lot of different places. But Wine Away is a stain remover, all natural. Maybe for the clumsy person on your shopping list, they use natural extracts from fruits and vegetables. There's no bleach in it, so that's kind of a fun one too. So, gifting wine. So, is there any better hostess gift than wine? I don't think so, right? If somebody shows up with a bottle of wine, they get a gold star in my book for the day. Yeah. So what you bring as a gift is more noticeable than you think. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but if that person is into wine, what you bring to the party might say a few things about you. So we'll talk about some proper etiquette. So if you're thinking about buying wine for a dinner or a party this holiday season, if you were to kind of go in order, I would say number one would be sparkling wine. That's kind of your go-to. Sparkling wine is always a good idea. It's food friendly. It's festive. It screams, let's celebrate, right? It instantly classes up your party with a bottle of sparkling. It's a great way to start the party off, right? If you're having appetizers or something like that, it's very festive. Don't get cheap, disgustingly sparkling wine. Usually not a good idea. It usually doesn't go great with food either. So usually stay towards your drier style sparkling. So that's my kind of go-to right there. Is number one is sparkling wine. Can't go wrong with a bottle of bubbly. Number two, go big or go home. Larger bottles mean, or larger parties mean larger bottles. Magnum bottles are always fun, right? This is a Magnum bottle, usually equals 2 bottles of wine, right? Really not, I mean, for a party of say 12, really not a whole ton of wine, but it makes you look cool, right? you get some instant party cred if you walk in with one of these to a party, right? You can find some great values too. Also, you can splurge on some too. Either way, you look really cool at your party. So go big or go home. Those are kind of fun. Red over white. It's not really discriminating on white wine. I'm not really saying red wine's better than white wine. But red kind of is perceived as more sophisticated too. Right? And I think there's more red wine drinkers than there are, well, I shouldn't say that because there's a lot of white wine drinkers, but they red wine has that perception of being more sophisticated. And so when you show up with a red wine as a gift, you look more sophisticated, okay? So the exception would be if you know your preference of your host. If they're a white wine drinker, then obviously white wine would be definitely appropriate, okay? And lastly, stay away from your cheap generic wines. It doesn't really convey too much sincerity or thought, right? And maybe stay away from obscure wines, again, unless you know your host, but too odd, and it may not look like you put a lot of thought into it. And if on the other end of the spectrum, you may seem too wine snobbish, right? If it's something really obscure. So on the flip side, what to do when receiving a bottle as a gift, right? The main question is to open or not to open the bottle of gift if someone were to present one to you, right? It's long debated in the wine world. What's the proper wine etiquette? And there's really no clear answer. I hate to say that, but the simplest solution is do what it feels right. If the bottle arrives unwrapped, usually the guest, it is meant to open up for dinner. They're assuming that it's a contribution to the meal. If the bottles are tied up, with a bow and in a bag, the gesture may be meant to be for a gift for you later down the road. Also take a peek inside. Maybe if it's something that will go with the meal, you could open it then. Or if it's really nice wine, maybe there's not enough to go around for your large party, right? Maybe thank them for the gift and then say, maybe in a couple weeks we'll come back and share it with them. So that would be a nice thing to do as well. So really no right way on how to accept the gift, but do what you feel right, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Stay up to date with what's happening in North Central Washington. Go to the NCW Life Community Calendar at ncwlife.com.